In the year 1050, two brothers named Ketil and Bjorn stood on a low hill in Södermanland, Sweden. They were watching a man named Asmund carve a stone. The stone was for their father, Holmgaut. Holmgaut was dead. He had not died at home. He had gone on a journey. The stone Asmund was carving would tell everyone where he went. The final inscription, written in the looping letters of the younger Futhark alphabet, told a simple, sad story. It said Holmgaut had gone in the east with Ingvar. Ingvar, the far-travelled, was a famous leader. Around the year 1040, he led a large expedition from Sweden. They traveled down the rivers of what is now Russia, heading for the Caspian Sea. They were looking for wealth, for new trade routes. But something went wrong. Disease, or a battle, or starvation, we don't know for sure. Almost no one came back. All across central Sweden, there are nearly 30 runestones, memorials raised by families for the men who died on that one trip. They are called the Ingvar stones. Holmgaut's stone is one of them. It remembers him not as a member of a specific race or people. It remembers him for what he did. He went on an expedition. In the language these people spoke, Old Norse. An overseas expedition was a Viking. A person who went on such a trip was a Vikinger. It was a job description. Holmgaut went on a Viking. He was a Vikinger on that one fatal journey. He was also a father, a farmer, a husband, a member of his community. But the one act, the one that got him killed far from home, was the one his sons chose to remember him by. It was not his identity, it was his last and most important action. And that single stone, one of 30 like it, tells us that the word we use today for an entire people was, to them, just a word for a trip someone took. Number 15. The word itself was an insult. In the late 9th century, a man named Thorolf Kveldolfsson lived in Norway. His story is told in a much later text, Eagle's Saga, written down in Iceland around the year 1230. The saga is a family history, full of poetry, violence, and legal disputes. It's not perfect history, but it gives us a window into how these people thought about themselves and their world. Thorolf was a successful man. He had a large farm, many followers, and a good relationship with the king, Harald Fairhair. But he had enemies. Two men, Herrick and Hrerik, were jealous of his success. They wanted his land and his position. So they started a campaign of rumors. They went to King Harald and told him lies about Thorolf. They claimed he was embezzling tax money. They claimed he was building up his own private army to challenge the king. King Harald, who was always worried about threats to his new power in a freshly unified Norway, listened. He became suspicious of Thorolf. The breaking point came when the king visited Thorolf's farm. Thorolf threw a magnificent feast for the king and his 300 men. He spared no expense, but Harik and Hrerik were there, whispering in the king's ear. They twisted Thorolf's generosity into a show of arrogant power. They said, "Look how he flaunts his wealth. He has more followers than you, my king. This is not the behavior of a loyal subject." Later, in a private conversation, the king confronted Thorolf. The accusations were laid out. Thorolf denied them, but the damage was done. At one point in the saga, Thorolf's enemies use a specific term to smear him. They don't just call him a traitor. They suggest his activities, his trading voyages, and his acquisition of wealth are not honorable. They imply he is acting like a Vikinger. In this context, the word was not a compliment. It was not a proud heritage. It was an accusation. It meant he was a freebooter, a pirate, someone who operated outside the law and social norms for personal gain. It suggested he was a predator, a man of violence, who preyed on others, for men like Harik and Hrerik, who saw themselves as landed aristocracy loyal to a king. Calling Thorolf a Vikinger was a way to paint him as a dangerous outsider, a social problem that needed to be dealt with. The king eventually turned on Thorolf completely. He sent men to Thorolf's farm. Thorolf and his followers defended themselves. They fought hard, but they were outnumbered. King Harald himself joined the final assault. Thorolf was killed. The king, seeing Thorolf's body, is said to have remarked that he was a great man and that it was a shame he had to die. But he had been convinced that Thorolf was a threat, a man whose ambition was too great. The label of Vikinger, with all its negative weight of lawlessness and violence, had helped seal his fate. The story, even if dramatized in the saga, shows a deep social tension. There was a difference between an honorable warrior serving a king and a Vikinger serving only himself. The word carried the sting of social disapproval. It was a term used by the establishment to describe those they could not control. It was not a name a whole people proudly called themselves. It was an insult, a label for a troublemaker, a pirate. Number 14, most people stayed home and farmed. In the year 1104, the volcano Hekla in southern Iceland erupted. It was a massive event. It threw a thick layer of pale, glassy ash and pumice across the land for miles. In the Jorsa Valley, a farming community was buried. The people there likely had enough warning to escape, but their homes and possessions were frozen in time, sealed under the volcanic debris. For centuries, the area was just a bumpy, desolate landscape. Then, in 1939, a team of Scandinavian archaeologists began to excavate. They uncovered the remains of a farm. They called it Stong. What they found was not a warrior's hall. It was the home of a family that worked the land, raised animals, and lived a life dictated by seasons, not by raiding. The main building was a longhouse about 28 meters long and 6 meters wide. The walls were thick, made of turf stacked over a stone foundation with a timber frame inside. This design was excellent for insulation against the harsh Icelandic weather. Inside, a long fire pit ran down the center of the main room. This was for cooking and heating. Along the sides were raised wooden platforms covered with skins or straw. This is where the family and their farmhands would have slept, worked on crafts, and told stories during the long, dark winters. The archaeologists found artifacts of daily life. They found loom weights made of stone used for weaving wool into cloth. In Iceland's economy was heavily based on sheep, and wool was a vital product, both for their own clothes and for trade. They found a quernstone, a simple hand mill for grinding grain, likely imported barley into flour for bread or porridge. They found iron nails, a knife, a whetstone for sharpening tools. Attached to the main longhouse was a smaller room. This was a byre, a shelter for their animals. The remains showed they kept cattle. The body heat from the animals in the attached byre would have helped warm the human living quarters. This was a practical design. A separate building nearby was identified as a smithy with a stone-built forge. Someone on this farm knew how to work iron, a crucial skill for making and repairing tools, nails, and household items. They were not just farmers, they were resourceful and skilled craftspeople. The life of the family at Stong was representative of the vast majority of people in the Scandinavian world during the so-called Viking Age. They were farmers, herders, and craftspeople. Their concerns were about the harvest, the health of their livestock, and surviving the winter. Their world was the valley they lived in, the neighbors they traded with, and the weather. While a few men from Iceland did go on expeditions, the foundation of the society was agriculture. The Icelandic sagas are full of disputes over land, grazing rights, and livestock. These were the things that mattered most. The man who owned the farm at Stong was not a Viking in the popular sense. He did not have a horned helmet or a massive axe. He likely had a wood axe for cutting timber and a small knife for daily tasks. His greatest treasures were not looted silver, but his cattle, his sheep, and his family. The eruption of Hekla in 1104, by preserving this one ordinary farm, gives us a more accurate picture of this society than 100 tales of raids and battles. It reminds us that for every man who went on a Viking, there were 100 more people who stayed home, milked the cows, and hoped for a good harvest. Number 13, the Viking Age is a line drawn on a map by historians. On June 8th, 793, the monks on the small island of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of England saw something they had never seen before. Ships long and sleek with dragon-headed prows appeared on the horizon. The men who came ashore were not merchants. They were raiders. They stormed the monastery, a famous center of Christian learning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of events kept in England at the time, describes it starkly. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. A scholar named Alcuin of York, who was from the region but was then serving in the court of Charlemagne in Francia, was horrified. He wrote letters back to England. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, he wrote. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. For many historians, this brutal, shocking attack marks the beginning of the Viking Age. It was a dramatic, well-documented event that seemed to announce the arrival of a new and terrifying force in Europe. Now, let's jump forward 273 years. On September 25th, 1066, a battle was fought at a bridge called Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire, England. On one side was the English army led by King Harold Godwinson. On the other side was an invading Norwegian army led by King Harald Hardrada. Hardrada was a famous warrior, a man who had served as a mercenary in the elite Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor. He was claiming the English throne. The battle was a surprise. The English army marched north with incredible speed and caught the Norwegians off guard. The fighting was fierce, especially at the narrow bridge. The English won a decisive victory. Harold Hardrada was killed, shot in the throat with an arrow. His army was shattered. For many historians, this event marks the end of the Viking Age. The last great Scandinavian invasion of England had failed. Just a few weeks later, Harold Godwinson would be defeated by another invader, William of Normandy, who was himself of Norse descent. The era of large-scale Scandinavian raids seemed to be over, so we have a start date, 793, and an end date, 1066. It seems neat, but it's an invention. It's a convenient label created by historians in the 19th century to define a period of time. It's useful for textbooks, but it's not real. There were Scandinavian raids before 793. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions an incident in 789 on the coast of Dorset, where 3 Northmen's ships landed, killed a royal official, and sailed away. It was a smaller event, less shocking than the attack on a holy site like Lindisfarne, but it was the same activity. And there were peaceful interactions too. Scandinavian traders were likely visiting ports in England and Francia for decades before the raids began. The contact didn't just start with an explosion of violence. Similarly, the world didn't magically change after 1066. Scandinavian kings continued to have ambitions in the British Isles. Magnus Barefoot of Norway launched expeditions to Scotland and Ireland in the late 11th century. The Norse earldom of Orkney in northern Scotland remained a powerful entity for centuries. Scandinavian culture, language, and people didn't vanish. They had settled and integrated, becoming part of the fabric of places like England, Scotland, Ireland, and Russia. The Viking Age is a historical construct. It's a box we've built to put a messy, complicated period of history into. No one living in the year 900 would have said, "We are in the middle of the Viking Age." They would have said they lived in the time of King Alfred, or that they were from Vestfold, or that they were a farmer trying to get by. The dates are just signposts, helpful for organizing the story, but they are not the story itself. The reality was a gradual process of contact, conflict, trade, and settlement that began before 793 and continued long after 1066. Number 12, they weren't just Norse. On the southern coast of the Baltic Sea in what is now Poland, there was a legendary fortress called Jomsborg. According to the sagas, particularly the Jomsvikinga saga, this was the headquarters of a fearsome brotherhood of warriors known as the Jomsvikings. They were mercenaries, a private army for hire, who lived by a strict code of conduct. The story goes that Jomsborg was founded in the 10th century by a Danish chieftain, either Palnatoke or the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, depending on the source. But the key thing about the Jomsvikings was that they were not defined by a single ethnicity. They were a professional organization. The saga says that Any man who was a proven warrior between the ages of 18 and 50 could apply to join as long as he wasn't a known troublemaker. The code demanded that they swear to defend each other as brothers, to share all plunder equally, and never to show fear or flee from a battle unless completely overwhelmed. While their leadership was often Danish, the ranks of the Jomsvikings were filled with men from all around the Baltic. There were Swedes and Norwegians, of course, but crucially, there were also Wends. The Wends were a Slavic people who lived along the Baltic coast in what is now Germany and Poland. They were often the enemies of the Scandinavians, but in the context of Jomsborg, they were comrades in arms. The fortress itself was located in Slavic territory. One of the most famous stories about the Jomsvikings is their role in the Battle of Hjörungavágr, which took place around the year 986. A powerful Norwegian ruler, Earl Hakon of Lade, had refused to serve the Danish King Harald Bluetooth. So Harald hired the Jomsvikings to attack Hakon and bring Norway back under Danish control. A large fleet of Jomsviking ships, led by Sigvaldi Strut Haraldsson, sailed for Norway. The force was a mix of Danes, Swedes, and Wends, all fighting under the Jomsviking banner. They met Earl Hakon's fleet in a fjord called Hjörungavágr. The battle was long and brutal. The Jomsvikings were formidable fighters, and at first they seemed to be winning. But Earl Hakon was a pagan who worshipped the old gods. According to the saga, he sacrificed his own 7-year-old son to the goddesses Thorgerd and Urpa to turn the tide of the battle. A sudden violent hailstorm broke out, blinding the Jomsvikings. The Norwegians, believing the storm was a sign of divine favor, renewed their attack with great ferocity. The Jomsvikings were defeated, many were killed, the survivors who were captured were executed. The saga tells a dramatic tale of their bravery in the face of death, with each man trying to outdo the last with a defiant final word. Whether the details of the saga are completely true is debated by historians. Jomsborg itself has never been definitively located by archaeologists. But the story reveals an important truth. The world of Baltic seafaring and warfare in this period was a melting pot. The lines between Scandinavian and Slavic were often blurry. A man's skill with an axe and his loyalty to his comrades mattered more than where he was born. Groups like the Jomsvikings were not ethnic armies, they were professional military companies. The term Viking often describes an occupation and a lifestyle, not a nationality. A Slavic Wend from the Pomeranian coast, fighting on a ship alongside a Dane from Zealand, was just as much a part of this world as anyone from Norway. It complicates the simple picture of a purely Scandinavian phenomenon. Number 11, they were called Ashmen by the people they met. In the year 845, a fleet of 120 ships sailed up the River Seine in Francia. They were led by a chieftain the Frankish sources call Reginaris, who is often identified with the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Their destination was the city of Paris. The king of West Francia, Charles the Bald, heard they were coming. He assembled an army to stop them. He split his forces, putting one half on the north bank of the river and the other half on the south bank. This was a mistake. Reginaris and his men ignored the larger force and attacked the smaller one on the south bank. They overwhelmed it. To intimidate the rest of the Frankish army, they took 111 prisoners and hanged them on an island in the Seine in full view of the other soldiers. The Frankish army, demoralized, did not fight. The invaders sailed on to Paris. The city was in a panic. Most of the population fled. Reginaris's men entered the city on Easter Sunday, March 28th, and plundered it. They took whatever they could carry. Charles the Bald, unable to defeat them militarily, chose to pay them to leave. He gave them 7,000 French livres, which was about 2,570 kilograms of silver and gold. It was a huge sum of money. This payment, known as Danegeld, set a dangerous precedent. It taught the raiders that Francia was rich and would pay to avoid destruction. Throughout this entire episode, and in all the other chronicles of the time written by the people who were attacked, the word Viking is never used. The Franks didn't call them Vikings, they had other names for them. Most commonly, they called them Nortmani, which simply means Northmen. Well, sometimes they were more specific, calling them Dani, or Danes, because many of the early raiding parties came from Denmark. In Ireland, the monks who wrote the Irish annals had their own terms. They called them Gael, meaning foreigners, or Lochlanne, meaning people of the lakes, or fjord men. They also made a distinction. The early raiders, mostly from Norway, were called Finn Gael, or white foreigners. The later raiders, who arrived around 851 and were mostly from Denmark, were called Dubgail, or dark foreigners. The Arabic-speaking world, which encountered these Scandinavians in Spain and through trade routes in Russia, had another name for them. They called them al-Majus. This was a term originally used for Zoroastrians, but it came to mean any pagan or fire worshipper. To a Muslim scholar in Cordoba, the key identifying feature of these northern raiders was not their origin or their ships, but their religion. They were heathens. One of the more poetic names comes from Germany, the Annals of Xanten, a record from the Rhineland called the Raiders Ascomani. This translates as Ashmen. It was a reference to the ships they used. The longships were often made from the wood of ash trees. So, to the people watching in terror from the riverbanks, they were the
Dash shipmen. What all these names have in common is that they are external descriptions.
They are labels given by outsiders. Nortmani, Gael, Majus, Ascomani. None of these are names the people called themselves as a collective. A man on one of those ships in 845 might have identified himself by his leader, one of Reginhirus's men, by his home region, I am from Vestfold, or by his family. He would not have said, I am a Viking. That word was for what he was doing, not what he was. The many names they were called by their victims show us that the people of Europe were trying to make sense of these new arrivals, labeling them by their direction of origin, their appearance, their religion, or their ships. Number 10. A Viking in Russia was something else entirely. Around the year 862, according to the Russian Primary Chronicle, a 12th century history of the early Kievan Ruses, the Slavic and Finnic tribes in the lands of northern Russia were fighting among themselves. The Chronicle says, they drove the Varangians back beyond the sea, refused to pay them tribute, and set out to govern themselves. But it didn't work. There was no law among them, but tribe rose against tribe. So there was discord among them, and they began to war one against another. Realizing they could not rule themselves, the tribes decided to invite a foreign prince to come and establish order. They sent a message across the sea to the Varangian Ruses. The message said, our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. 3 brothers accepted the invitation. Their names were Rurik, Senius, and Truver. They were from a people called the Ruses. The Chronicle states that these Ruses were a Varangian tribe, in the same way that others were Swedes or Normans or Angles. Rurik settled in Novgorod. His brothers settled in other towns nearby. After his brothers died, Rurik took control of the whole region. He is considered the founder of the Rurikid dynasty, which would rule Russia for more than 700 years. The story is likely a simplified, legendary account of a more complex process, but it highlights a completely different type of Scandinavian activity in the East. These were not just raiders, they were merchants, mercenaries, and eventually state builders. The term Varangian comes from the Old Norse word Varangar, which probably means sworn companions, referring to men bound by an oath. The term Ruses is also believed to come from Old Norse. One theory is that it derives from Roths, a term related to rowing. So the Ruses were the men who row. This name was given to them by the Finns, who called the Swedes Ruotsi, a name that still exists in Finnish and Estonian today. The Slavic tribes then borrowed the name from the Finns. Eventually, the land these Ruses came to rule became known as the land of the Ruses, Russia. These Varangian Rus did not come to just plunder and leave, they established a vast trading network. They used the rivers of Russia, the Dnieper, the Volga as highways. They traveled south to the Black Sea and the great city of Constantinople, which they called Miklagard. And they traveled southeast down the Volga to the Caspian Sea to trade with the Abbasid Caliphate. Archaeologists have found enormous numbers of Arabic silver coins called dirhams in Scandinavia, especially on the Swedish island of Gotland. These coins were the payment for the goods the Ruses brought south, furs from the northern forests, honey, wax, and most importantly, slaves captured from the Slavic territories. They were merchants on a grand scale connecting northern Europe with the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. A man like Rurik was a political entrepreneur. He used his military skill not for smash and grab raids, but to impose order, collect tribute, and create a state that could control and profit from this lucrative trade. And, the role of the Scandinavian in the East was that of a ruling military and commercial elite. They assimilated over time, adopting Slavic language and customs, but their origin was as organizers and rulers invited in, according to the legend, to do a specific job. Calling Rurik a Viking, in the same sense as the man who sacked Lindisfarne, misses the point entirely. They were two different professions, two different outcomes of the same outward expansion of Scandinavian peoples. Number 9, the term vanished for 700 years. After the year 1100, the world changed. The kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became more like other European kingdoms. They had centralized monarchies, organized churches, and standing armies. The old system of chieftains gathering followers for seasonal overseas expeditions faded away. The activity of Viking largely ceased, and the word itself went with it. Outside of Iceland, where old stories and sagas were still being copied by scribes, the word Viking fell out of common use in Scandinavia. If it was used at all, it retained its old negative meaning of pirate or sea robber. For the next 600 or 700 years, if you asked a farmer in Denmark or a merchant in Sweden about Vikings, they likely would not have known what you were talking about. It was not a part of their identity. They were Danes, Swedes, Norwegians. They were Christians. The Viking past was a distant, pagan, and slightly embarrassing chapter of their ancient history, largely forgotten by the general population. Then, in the 19th century, something changed. A cultural movement called Romanticism was sweeping across Europe. It was a reaction against the cold logic of the Enlightenment. Romantics were interested in emotion, nature, folklore, and the ancient past. In each country, scholars, poets, and artists began to look back to their golden age to forge a new sense of national identity. In Scandinavia, this meant rediscovering the sagas. Scholars like the Swede Erik Gustaf Geijer began to translate and popularize the old texts. Geijer wrote a famous poem in 1811 called The Viking Vikingen, but his Viking was not the pirate of the old sources. He was a heroic, freedom-loving, noble figure. He was a symbol of national pride, a rugged individualist who was master of his own destiny. This new romanticized image of the Viking caught on. The Danish poet Adam Oehlenschläger and the writer N.F.S. Grundtvig also promoted this heroic vision of the past. Artists began to paint dramatic scenes of longships sailing through stormy seas and warriors with flowing blonde hair. The Viking was reborn not as a historical figure, but as a national hero. This happened all over Europe. The British revived the legend of King Arthur. The Germans celebrated their ancient Germanic tribes. The Scandinavians chose the Viking. It was the perfect symbol for small nations trying to assert their cultural importance in a Europe dominated by giants like Britain, France, and Germany. This 19th century invention is the direct ancestor of our modern idea of the Viking. The idea that Viking refers to an entire people, that it's a proud ethnic heritage, that it represents a spirit of adventure and strength. All of this comes from the romantic nationalism of the 1800s. It was so successful that it completely replaced the original meaning of the word. When we talk about Vikings today, we are, in a sense, speaking a 19th century language. We are using a term that was deliberately revived and redefined to serve a modern political and cultural purpose. The 700-year gap is crucial. It shows that the connection was broken. The modern Viking is a reconstruction, a romantic fantasy projected onto the past. It has much more to do with the 19th century's need for national heroes than with the 10th century's reality of a man going on a seasonal raid. Number 8, the horned helmet was a 19th century opera costume. In 1876, the first complete performance of Richard Wagner's massive four-opera cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen took place in a specially built theater in Bayreuth, Germany. It was a huge cultural event. The opera cycle was based on Norse and Germanic myths, featuring gods like Wotan Odin and Donar Thor, and heroes like Siegfried. The man responsible for designing the costumes was Carl Emil Dupler. He read the ancient myths and sagas, but he was also a man of his time, influenced by 19th century romantic art. For the warriors in the opera, especially the antagonists like Hunding and Hagen, Doppler created a dramatic, fearsome look. He gave them helmets adorned with horns, wings, and other animal features. These designs looked spectacular on stage under the new gaslights of the theater. They conveyed a sense of primal, barbarian power. The opera was a sensation. It was performed all over Europe and America. The image of the brawny, bearded opera singer in a horned helmet became indelibly linked with the ancient Germanic and Norse past. This image was so powerful, so visually striking, that it jumped from the opera stage into popular illustrations, books, and eventually movies and cartoons. The horned helmet became the ultimate visual shorthand for Viking. The problem is, it's completely wrong. Archaeologists have been excavating sites from this period for over 150 years. They have found thousands of swords, spears, axes, and pieces of jewelry. They have found exactly one complete helmet from the entire Scandinavian Viking Age. It was discovered in 1943 at a farm called Jomsborg in Norway. The Jomsborg helmet dates to the 10th century. It is a simple, practical piece of military equipment. It consists of a bowl made of 4 interconnected iron plates. It has a single spike on top and a spectacle guard that protects the eyes and nose. And it looks a bit like a modern ski mask made of iron. There are no horns. There is no place to attach horns. Horns on a helmet would be a terrible idea in a real fight. They would give your opponent something to grab onto. A blow from an axe or sword could catch on a horn and twist your neck. A helmet's purpose is to deflect blows, to be smooth, and glance off attacks. Its horns do the opposite. There are a few pre-Viking Age depictions of figures with horned helmets, like on the Galahus horns from Denmark dating to the 5th century, or a plate from a helmet found at Sutton Hoo in England, 7th century. But these are from centuries before the Viking Age and are likely ceremonial or mythological representations, not depictions of actual battle gear. By the time of the main raiding period, 8th, 11th centuries, this style was long gone. The horned helmet is a fiction born on an opera stage in 1876. It was created by Carl Emil Doppler to make his characters look fierce for a 19th century audience. It tells us a lot about the romantic imagination of that era, but nothing at all about the reality of what a warrior from 10th century Norway would have worn to protect his head in a battle. The real helmet, the Jomsborg helmet, is far less dramatic, but it has the great virtue of being real. It was a tool for survival, not a piece of theater. Number 7, they were obsessed with silver, not gold. In the summer of 1999, a farmer named Bjorn Engstrom was plowing a field on his property, Spillings Farm, on the Swedish island of Gotland. His plow hit something hard. He stopped to check and found a few strange-looking old coins. Thinking he might have found something interesting, he contacted archaeologists. What they uncovered over the next few weeks was staggering. It became known as the Spillings Hoard, the largest Viking silver hoard ever discovered. It wasn't just one find, it was 2 separate deposits, buried only a few meters apart, likely in the 9th century. The total weight of the silver was about 67 kilograms, but the most fascinating part was not the quantity, but the composition. This was not a treasure chest full of gold doubloons and sparkling jewels like in a pirate movie. The vast majority of the hoard was made up of silver coins from the Islamic world. There were over 14,200 coins known as dirhams from places like Baghdad, Damascus, and Tashkent in Central Asia. Many of them were broken into pieces. Alongside the coins, there was a huge amount of what archaeologists call hack silver. These were silver objects, arm rings, neck rings, pendants, even silver bars. that had been chopped up into smaller pieces. There were also complete arm rings, beautifully decorated, many of them from Russia or Eastern Europe. The third part of the hoard was a massive bronze cauldron filled with scrap metal. The Spillings hoard is a perfect snapshot of the Viking Age economy. It was a silver-based economy, not a gold one. Gold was rare and mostly used by kings and the highest-ranking chieftains for display. For everyone else, silver was the medium of exchange, and it was a bullion economy. That means the silver was valued by its weight, not by the face value of the coins. This is why so many of the coins and bracelets were chopped up. A merchant from Gotland in the 9th century didn't care that a coin was minted by the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad. What he cared about was that it was made of high-quality silver. When he needed to buy something like a cow or a new boat, he would get out a small set of folding scales, many of which had been found in graves, weigh out the required amount of silver, and cut a piece off a coin or a bracelet to make the correct weight. This is Hack Silver. The hoard tells a story of a vast trade network. The man who buried this treasure at Spillings was not primarily a raider in Western Europe. He was a merchant who looked east. He, or his ancestors, had traveled the rivers of Russia down to the Caspian and Black Seas. They had traded furs, slaves, and amber with the Islamic caliphates and received payment in silver dirhams. They brought this silver back home to Gotland, which was a major hub for this eastern trade. The image of a Viking warrior stuffing his pockets with gold coins from a plundered English monastery is not wrong, but it's incomplete. The more typical and arguably more important economic activity was the long-distance trade for silver. The Spillings hoard, found by a farmer in a field, gives us a much more accurate picture of their real obsession. It wasn't about chests of gold treasure, it was about sacks of silver, weighed out on a tiny pair of scales to do business. Number 6, a Viking, could be a merchant from Birka. On the island of Bjorko in Lake Mälaren, not far from modern Stockholm, lie the remains of a town called Birka. Founded in the mid-8th century, it was one of the most important trading centers in Northern Europe for about 200 years. Today, it's a field of grass-covered mounds, but archaeology has revealed what it was like in the year 850. And Birka was not a typical farming village. It was a planned, bustling town, a hub of international commerce. It had a permanent population of perhaps 700 to 1,000 people. There was a fortress on a high cliff to protect it, and a large harbor where ships from all over the known world would dock. The town itself was laid out in plots, with houses that also served as workshops and storefronts. Let's imagine the life of a merchant who lived in Birka. We can call him Orm. His house is made of wood and wattle and daub. Inside his family lives, but the front of the house is his workshop. He is a craftsman, perhaps making combs out of deer antler, a common industry in Birka. The floor is littered with the shavings. But Orm is also a long-distance trader. In the spring, he loads his ship. It's a nar, a wider, deeper vessel than the military longship, designed for carrying cargo, not warriors. He loads his ship with local goods, iron bars smelted in the Swedish forests, high-quality whetstones from Norway, and bundles of fursbear, marten, fox brought by traders from the far north. He sails east across the Baltic Sea to the coast of what is now Latvia. He enters the mouth of the Daugava River and sails inland, trading with the local Baltic tribes. He might continue into the river systems of Russia, joining a caravan of other merchants heading south. They travel to places like Kiev, a growing city controlled by fellow Scandinavians, the Russes. From there, the great prize is the trade route to the south, down the Dnieper River to the Black Sea, and the magnificent city of Constantinople, or down the Volga to the Caspian Sea and the markets of the Islamic world. In these markets, Orm trades his northern goods. He sells his iron and furs. In return, he buys exotic, high-value items. He buys bags of silver dirham coins from the Caliphate. He buys beautiful glass beakers made in the Rhineland, which have somehow made their way to these eastern markets. And he buys lustrous silk from China, which has traveled thousands of miles along the Silk Road. He might even acquire a small bronze statue of the Buddha from India, a strange and exotic curiosity. After months of travel, he returns to Burka. He sells these foreign goods in the market there. A local chieftain buys a silk tunic to show off his wealth. A craftswoman buys the glass beaker to be buried with her as a sign of her status. Orm weighs out the silver coins he earned to buy more land or a better boat. The archaeological finds from the graves at Burka confirm this story. Archaeologists have found the silk, the Frankish glassware, the Arabic coins, and even the Buddha statue. They have found the scales and weights used by the merchants. They have found the workshops of the comb makers, the blacksmiths, and the bead makers. Orm, the merchant of Burka, was a Mon of the Viking Age. He lived at the same time as the raiders who attacked England. He was a Scandinavian seafarer, but to call him a Viking in the popular sense is to misunderstand his entire life. His goal was not plunder, but profit. His skills were not just in fighting, but in navigation, negotiation, and languages. He was a part of a sophisticated, interconnected global economy. The town of Birka shows that this era was as much about trade and enterprise as it was about raiding and warfare. Number 5, English is half a Viking language. In the year 878, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex was on the brink of collapse. A large Danish army, which the English called the Great Heathen Army, had overrun most of England. The King of Wessex, Alfred, was in hiding in the marshes of Somerset. It looked like the last independent English kingdom would fall, but Alfred fought back. He gathered an army, defeated the Danes at the Battle of Edington, and forced their leader Guthrum to make a treaty. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, agreed to around 886, was a landmark document. It drew a line across England. The south and west, including Wessex and London, would be ruled by Alfred. The north and east would be controlled by the Danes. This area came to be known as the Danelaw. This was not just a military occupation. The treaty marked the beginning of a period of massive Danish settlement. Tens of thousands of Danish farmers, traders, and warriors settled in the Danelaw. For the next 200 years, in towns like York, which they called Jorvik, Lincoln, and Leicester, 2 languages were spoken side by side, Old English and Old Norse. The 2 languages were related, both were Germanic languages, they shared a lot of basic vocabulary. An Old English speaker might say knit for boy, while an Old Norse speaker would say niktor. They could probably understand each other with some difficulty, like a modern Spanish speaker talking to a Portuguese speaker. But this intense daily contact in the marketplaces, fields, and homes of the Danelaw led to a profound change in the English language. When 2 languages are in close contact, they borrow words from each other. But something more radical happened here, because the basic grammar was similar, but the word endings were different. It seems people started to drop the complicated grammatical endings to make it easier to communicate. This is one of the reasons modern English has much simpler grammar than other Germanic languages like German or Dutch. And English borrowed a huge number of words from Old Norse. These weren't fancy literary words. They were everyday, fundamental words. The core of our language was reshaped. The pronouns they, them, and their are from Old Norse. They replaced the Old English pronouns hi, him, and hiera. This is an incredibly rare event in linguistics. Languages almost never borrow pronouns. The fact that English did shows the depth of the Norse influence. Look at a list of common English words that come from Old Norse: sky, skin, skill, scrape, scrub, window from vindaga, meaning windeye, husband from husbandi, house dweller, leg, neck, knife, dirt, egg, kid, bull, reindeer. The verb are is from Old Norse. Even the word law itself is a Norse loanword. Sometimes we kept both the Old English and the Old Norse words, but they took on slightly different meanings. Old English had sick, Old Norse had ill, Old English had craft, Old Norse had skill, Old English had hide, Old Norse had skin. This linguistic mixing happened because Vikings were not just raiders who came and went, they were settlers who stayed, farmed, married, and raised families. They became part of the local population. The English language we speak today is a direct result of this coexistence. It is a hybrid language, a blend of Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian. The voice of the Danish farmer who settled in Yorkshire 1,000 years ago is still present every time we look up at the sky or talk about their house. The influence was not just a matter of swords and fire, it was a matter of words and grammar. Number 4, the most famous Vikings were Christians. Nut the Great was born around the year 990. He was the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, the king of Denmark. In his youth, he was a classic Viking warrior prince. He participated in his father's successful invasion of England in 1013. After his father's death, he fought a brutal war against the English king Edmund Ironside to secure his own claim to the throne. By 1016, he was the undisputed king of all England. A few years later, he also inherited the thrones of Denmark and Norway and ruled parts of Sweden. He was the ruler of a vast North Sea empire. By any definition, Snute was a product of the Viking world. He came to power through conquest. He was a Danish king ruling over England. But once in power, he did something that shatters the stereotype of the pagan barbarian. He became a model Christian king. Knut understood that to rule England effectively, he had to be seen as a legitimate, pious, and just ruler, not a foreign conqueror. He embraced the English church. He made generous donations to monasteries and churches, including the Great Abbey at Canterbury. He respected English laws and traditions, issuing a law code that was largely based on previous English ones. He wanted to show that he was not there to destroy English society, but to lead it. The most remarkable demonstration of his transformation was his journey to Rome in 1027. He traveled across Europe to attend the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II. This was not a military campaign, it was a pilgrimage. It was a brilliant political move. By appearing in Rome, the center of Christendom, alongside the emperor and the pope, he was presenting himself on the world stage as a major European monarch and equal to any other king. He wrote a letter from Rome and sent it back to his subjects in England. The letter is an amazing document. He describes his journey and his meetings with the Pope and the Emperor, but most of the letter is about the practical deals he made for his people. He wrote that he had complained to the Pope about the excessive fees demanded from English archbishops when they traveled to Rome to receive their pallium, a symbol of their office. The Pope agreed to reduce the fees. He also wrote that he had negotiated with the Emperor and other princes to ensure better security and lower tolls for English and Danish merchants and pilgrims traveling to Rome. They should not be hindered by so many barriers on the road, nor harassed with unjust tolls, he declared. This is not the letter of a savage raider. It is the letter of a sophisticated statesman, concerned with diplomacy, trade, and the welfare of his subjects. He presents himself as their protector and benefactor. He ends the letter by vowing to rule justly and to correct any injustices from his youth. I have no need to amass money for myself by any unjust means, he wrote, signaling a break from the rapacious behavior of his past. Nut the Great is a perfect example of how the Scandinavian world was changing. The leaders of the 11th century were not the same as the chieftains of the 9th century. They were adopting Christianity and the European model of kingship. They were building states, writing laws, and engaging in international diplomacy. Knut, perhaps the most powerful and successful ruler of the entire Viking Age, was not a pagan hiding in a misty fjord. He was a Christian king, a European emperor who corresponded with the Pope and managed a complex multinational empire. His story shows that the age of raiding was transforming into an age of Christian kingdoms. Number 3, the toughest fighters weren't hired to raid, but to guard an emperor. Around the year 1030, a young Norwegian nobleman named Harald Sigurdsson had to flee his home. He was only 15 years old, but he had fought on the losing side at the Battle of Stiklestad, where his half-brother, King Olaf II, was killed. With his brother dead and his enemies in power, Harald was a wanted man. He escaped and began a long journey that would make him one of the most famous men of his age. His journey took him east through the lands of the Kievan Russes. He spent some time at the court of the ruler Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev, but Harold was ambitious and wanted to make his fortune, so he continued south with a company of about 500 followers until he reached the greatest city he had ever seen, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Norsemen called it Miklagard, the Great City. Constantinople was the richest, largest, and most sophisticated city in the Christian world, and its emperor needed bodyguards he could trust. The local politics of the Byzantine court were notoriously treacherous, where emperors were often overthrown and assassinated by their own generals and courtiers, so for decades the emperors had hired foreign mercenaries to serve as their personal guard. The most elite of these were the Varangian Guard. The guard was composed almost entirely of Scandinavians and Russes. They were famous for their towering height, their massive broadaxes, and their fierce loyalty as long as they were paid. They lived in barracks in the imperial palace, and their job was to protect the emperor's life at all costs. They were the emperor's axe-bearing guards. Harold, with his royal blood and military prowess, was a natural fit. He and his men enlisted in the Varangian Guard. For the next decade, Harold served the Byzantine emperors. He was not a raider, but a professional soldier in a regular army. He fought for the empire on many fronts. He fought against Arab pirates in the Aegean Sea. He fought in Sicily as part of a campaign to reconquer the island from the Muslims. He traveled to the Holy Land and fought in and around Jerusalem. According to the sagas, he was a brilliant commander and a ferocious warrior, and he rose to a high rank within the guard. The service was also incredibly lucrative. The Varangians were paid well, but they also had the right to a portion of the plunder from successful campaigns. The most unique privilege was the right of Pulitzewarf. When an emperor died, the Varangians had the right to run to the imperial treasury and take as much gold and treasure as they could carry. Well, Harold became fabulously wealthy. The sagas say that he sent all the treasure he accumulated back north to Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev for safekeeping. By the time he was ready to leave Constantinople around 1042, he had amassed a fortune so large that it was said to have taken 12 ships to carry it. He returned to Kiev, married Yaroslav's daughter, and then used his immense wealth to go back to Norway. He made a deal with his nephew, the current king, to rule as co-king. Soon after, his nephew died, and Harold became the sole king of Norway. He was known as Harald Hardrada, or Hard Ruler. His story completely inverts the common idea of a Viking. He was a Scandinavian warrior who used his martial skills not to attack a rich civilization, but to serve and defend it. He was a professional soldier, a mercenary general, operating within the power structure of the most advanced state in Europe. His journey to the great city was not for plunder, but for a career. The wealth he gained allowed him to return home and seize a crown. The Varangian Guard shows that the military talents of these northern men were a commodity, one they could sell to the highest bidder, whether that was a king in Kiev or an emperor in Constantinople. Number 2. A woman could inherit land, but the Shield Maiden is mostly myth. In the 1870s, the Swedish archaeologist Hjalmar Stolpe was excavating the vast burial grounds near the trading town of Birka. In one grave, designated BJ 581, he found something spectacular. It was a chamber grave, a sign of a high-status individual. The person inside had been buried sitting up, dressed in fine clothes, and they were surrounded by weapons. There was a sword, an axe, a spear, 2 shields, a battle knife, and a set of arrows designed to pierce armor. Also in the grave were 2 horses, a mare and a stallion, buried with the deceased. For over a century, the interpretation was obvious. This was the grave of a high-ranking warrior, a military leader, a Viking chieftain. The skeleton was assumed to be male. It was displayed in museums and written about in books as a prime example of a powerful male warrior. But in the 2010s, a team of researchers led by osteologist Anna Källström at Stockholm University noticed something odd about the skeleton's bones. The hip bones seemed rather wide, and the cheekbones were less prominent than a typical male skeleton. She suspected he might actually be a she. This led to a full-scale study led by Charlotte Hedenstierna Johnson, published in 2017. They extracted DNA from a tooth and an arm bone of the skeleton. The results were conclusive. The individual had 2 X chromosomes. The great warrior of grave BJ 581 was a woman, The news caused an international sensation. Headlines around the world proclaimed the discovery of a real-life shield maiden, or a female Viking warrior commander. It seemed to confirm the stories in the sagas and legends of women fighting alongside men. The reality, however, is much more complicated. The sagas that mention warrior women, like the story of Lagertha in the Gesta Danorum or Hervor in the Hervarar saga, are works of literature and mythology, not factual historical accounts. They were written down hundreds of years after the events they describe in a Christian Iceland that was fascinated by its pagan past. They are not reliable evidence for the existence of female warriors as a common phenomenon. The Birka grave is so far unique, and it is the only grave of a woman from this period found with a complete set of professional warrior equipment. One single exceptional case does not prove that there was a whole class of female warriors. She could have been an anomaly. The weapons could have been symbolic heirlooms or a sign of her family's status rather than her personal profession. We simply don't know the story behind this one burial. It's a mystery. What we do know from more reliable sources like law codes and runestones is that women in Scandinavian society had a significant degree of agency and status compared to many other parts of contemporary Europe. A woman could inherit property. A free woman had the right to consent to her own marriage. She could divorce her husband if he was abusive or failed to provide for the family. When a man left on a trading voyage or a raid, his wife, the husfreyja or lady of the house, ran the farm. She was in charge, holding the keys to the storehouses. Runestones were often raised by women or in memory of women. The Dinna stone in Norway from the 11th century was raised by a mother in memory of her daughter, Astrid. It commemorates her as the handiest maiden in Hadland. This shows a woman's skill and reputation were things to be celebrated publicly. So the picture is mixed. The shield maiden as a common, warrior type is almost certainly a myth, a creation of literature and modern pop culture. The Birka grave is a tantalizing but isolated piece of evidence that we are still trying to understand. But the real historical women of this era were not just passive figures. They were landowners, farm managers, and respected members of society with legal rights. Their power was not typically found on the battlefield with a sword, but at home running the farm and controlling the household economy. This reality is less dramatic than the myth of the Shield Maiden, but it is no less important. Number 1, the first European born in America was the son of a Viking. Around the year 1000, a man named Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from the Norse settlement in Greenland. Following stories from another sailor who had been blown off course, Leif was searching for new land. He and his crew found it. They landed in a place they described as having forests, meadows, and rivers full of salmon. They found wild grapes growing, so they called the place Vinland, or Winland. They built a small settlement and spent the winter there before sailing back to Greenland with a cargo of timber, a valuable resource in treeless Greenland. A few years later, around 1010, a much larger expedition set out for Vinland. This was not just for exploration, it was an attempt to colonize. The leader was an Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni. He was a wealthy and respected man. His wife was Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, a remarkable woman whose life story involved traveling across the Norse world. The expedition included 3 ships, about 160 people, and livestock. They found Leif's old settlement, which they called Leifsbudir Leif's Booths, and made it their base. The archaeological remains of this site were discovered in the 1960s at L'Anse Eos Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. The excavations confirmed the Norse presence, finding the remains of turf-walled longhouses, a smithy for working iron, and artifacts like a bronze cloak pin and a spindle whorl for making yarn. This was a community trying to build a new life. They explored the surrounding country, harvested timber, and grazed their cattle. And during their first year in this new world, Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir gave birth to a son. They named him Snorri Thorfinnsson. Snorri was the first European known to have been born in the Americas. His birth was not part of a raid or a military conquest. It was part of a family's attempt to build a settlement, to farm, and to create a new branch of their society across the ocean. The story of the Vinland settlement is a story of exploration, colonization, and domestic life. The settlement, however, did not last. The Norse sagas, the Saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red's saga, describe the reason why. They encountered the indigenous people of the area. The Norse called them Skraelingar. At first, the interactions were peaceful. The Norse traded cloth and milk for furs. But tensions grew. A misunderstanding or a violent incident led to conflict. The Norse had iron weapons, but they were vastly outnumbered. In one famous story from the sagas, the Skraelingar attacked the settlement. The Norsemen panicked and began to flee. But Freydis, Leif Erikson's half-sister, who was pregnant, shamed them for running from such wretched men. She grabbed the sword of a fallen man, slapped her bare breast with the flat of the blade, and let out a fierce war cry. The sight of this apparently terrified the attackers, who retreated. Despite such moments of defiance, the Norse realized they could not sustain the settlement. The hostility of the native population was too great. After about 3 years, Thorfinn, Karlsefni, and the rest of the colonists, including the young boy Snorri, packed up and sailed back to Greenland, and then eventually back to Iceland. Snorri Thorfinnsson grew up in Iceland. He inherited his father's farm and became a respected man. His descendants included several important figures in Icelandic history, including a bishop. His story, and the story of the Vinland colony, represents the incredible reach of these Scandinavian seafarers. They were not just moving east and south into Europe, they were also pushing west across the open Atlantic a full 500 years before Columbus. But it also reframes their activity. The journey to Vinland was not a Viking in the raiding sense. It was a pioneering colonial venture driven by the search for resources and new land. The central figures were not just warriors, but a merchant, his wife, and their newborn son, a family trying to make a life on the edge of the known world.